and some of them are teaching, some of them are working in other institutes, some are...
I see.
So
Okay.
they have requested us that even though we are not able to listen to the lecture when it is happening, please make it available online so that we can attend the quiz, we can listen to the lectures.
Yes, I'm good with that. Yeah. Yes, I'm fine with that, except that it shouldn't be a public, meaning it would be good if it is available through access. That is, those who are part of the course can happily, because, you know, sometimes you miss something, you're not there, you want to listen to it again. That's absolutely, that's the few plus points you have with this whole business of online.
Yes.
But it shouldn't become a public...
No, it's not a public thing. It is uploaded on MAP chapter of Delhi University first, and secondly, the philosophy project who is organizing this program along with us.
So there's a pathway, and people who want to access it through that pathway of yours, absolutely open. Okay. I'm good with that.
So with this, I think we can start the session. So I would like to invite Urna to take over the session and introduce ma'am.
Thank you so much. All right, so yes, just a second. My laptop is giving me a great deal of trouble today. But hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Urna, and I am a managing editor here at the Philosophy Project. It's my honor today to introduce our speaker. Professor Mary John teaches at the Center for Women's Development Studies, New Delhi, where she was director from 2006 to 2012. Before that, she served as the deputy director of the Women's Studies program at JNU. Professor John's work includes Discrepant Dislocations, Feminism, Theory, and Postcolonial Histories, A Question of Silence, The Sexual Economies of Modern India, Women's Studies in India, a Reader, the co-edited volume, Women in the Worlds of Labor, Interdisciplinary and Intersectional Perspectives, and the book, Child Marriage in an International Frame. Child Marriage in an International Frame, a feminist review from India. Professor John was the co-chair of the task force set up by the University Grants Commission to look into sexual harassment on Indian campuses. And she and her team brought out the 2013 report, Saksham, Measures for Ensuring Safety of Women and Programs for Gender Sensitization on Campuses. Professor John has been conducting a range of field-based research projects on themes relating to family and marriage. She has published several reports on adverse child sex ratios and gender-biased sex selection in the following volumes: Planning Families, Planning Gender, Sex Ratios and Gender-Biased Sex Selection, History, Debates, and Future Directions, and Political and Social Economy of Sex Selection, Exploring Family Development Linkages. Welcome, ma'am. We are very excited for your presentation today, which will bring feminism and philosophy into dialogue using a number of analytical frameworks, including feminist critiques of liberal contract theory and what ma'am calls the paradox of gender. Over to you, Professor John. We're very pleased again to have you with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Urna, and thank you all for inviting me. And I was just speaking to Dr. Jaiswal, and very excited to see this project, which is student-led, and the support coming from the Indian Council of Philosophical Research. You know, these are important things in the times we're in, to see this kind of positive energy and to see institutional backing to that energy. That's really made me very, very happy. I am going to try, this is, really more setting out some ideas that could be maybe part of a conversation between us. As you know, I'm in a women's studies center. I have been actually doing a lot more what would be considered very mainstream social science research. As I mentioned to Dr. Jaiswal, I did study philosophy for a couple of years. I have an MPhil in philosophy. That's a whole while ago, but I do think it sort of has left its imprint on me and on the way I think and I sometimes think everybody should. There are some, I don't know if you know this, I think in France, I believe that even that philosophy is a compulsory subject in schools, in high school. Every student has to study a little bit of philosophy. It's part of their, it's just a subject that they have to study. I think, we should have some version of that everywhere. I mean, it's a way of thinking. It's a way of subjecting yourself to a certain kind of a rational scrutiny, as well as recognizing the limits of that kind of rational scrutiny. And I wish there was, I wish it was everywhere in that sense. So this was an occasion for me to revisit a little bit. Also, we have been teaching a course, an MPhil PhD program in Women and Gender Studies with the Ambedkar University, Delhi. And we have courses, amongst our courses is a feminist theory course, or theories course, I should say. And within that, we also have looked at, and that's an occasion to look at a lot of texts that would probably count quite squarely as within versions of feminist philosophy. So in this lecture today, or conversation, or lecture towards a conversation, I hope this will be a dialogue as well, since you're full-time students in the field of philosophy. I thought I'd try two kinds of things. One, looking at how a feminist political theorist has in fact done what might be more, shall I say, more recognizably the task of taking philosophy, in this case, political philosophy, on board and subjecting it to a very, very deep critique. So my first example, this is the work of, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Carol Pateman, who has written a book called The Sexual Contract. It's a very, very interesting book. I think she wrote it sometime in the 80s, 1986. So it's dated in the sense of its time, but not in terms of its ideas, it seems to me. So I want to look at what she's doing there as one part of my presentation. And in the other part of my presentation, I thought I'd go about the story from the other side. That is to say, as from the side of our look. So one is to say that you take philosophy as a kind of body of work, as it has been now institutionalized and subjected to a certain kind of feminist perspective. The other is to say, what can philosophy do for us? Us, in this case, being not necessarily people who are in philosophy departments, feminists who, in engaging in their debates, who are trying to make their work as rigorous as possible, who are using concepts of analysis in order to further their work in the field of women or gender studies, and what can philosophy do for them? That is to say, what tools of philosophy, what investigative techniques that we think of as philosophical can be helpful here. And that's the second part, a little bit of what I want to do and the limits of that. Okay, so in the first part, and is it okay if I take about 45 minutes or so? Is that, yeah? Okay. So in this first part, I don't know, is there anybody here who's read, just to give me an idea, has anybody read The Sexual Contract or is familiar with? Okay, we have, okay, all right, great. I see some hands up, so that's wonderful. But no, I will not assume, and more hands are coming up, so great. I will, however, not assume that all of you have read it, and I will go over. So for those of you who are familiar with it, that's even greater for me, because then we can, move together forward. What Carol Pateman is trying to do is to bring in a critique to this sphere of thought that is, in some sense, I would say, or in mainstream, not me, let us say mainstream constructions of the history of philosophy, modern philosophy, a good chunk of modern philosophy is thought of as liberal political theory and is associated with a set of names like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, and so on and so on. Hobbes, and all these figures who are seen as, and this is not just unique to philosophy or to political theory, but they are seen as inaugurating or giving expression to a moment in terms of the birth of the modern notions that we think of as belonging to liberal thinking, the ideas of reason, the ideas of the individual, the ideas of fraternity, liberty, equality. Some of this, you might say that these are in fact the bedrock of contemporary democratic modern life as we know it. And precisely the contrast is drawn then with a pre-modern time, pre-modern modes where either in terms of some kind of notion of religion or other notions of ascribed status, people were understood as not being equal. People were understood as naturally requiring a sovereign, such as a king or the head of a tribe, and so on, and were not thought of as full participants in their own lives with equality with each other. So we're looking at a very, very huge and very significant time and moment. And this moment, one of the ways in which the creation of the modern individual with modern rights, with modern property rights in their person, and is the capacity to enter into contracts with one another. And so the idea here is that this is indeed a time when you enter into one individual enters into a relationship with another individual based on a contract that is sanctioned by the state, is precisely a free act, a consensual act that you undertake as distinct from being in a relationship of servitude or slavery or subordination that is in fact sanctioned by some other power, whether it be religious doctrine or kingships, monarchies, whatever, right? So this is the terrain within which Carol Pateman, as a feminist, or is using feminist resources to say, stop, wait a minute. This story is radically incomplete. This story of the move from a time when people were part of a status-ridden society, and we can have the equivalent in our context as well, a status-ridden society. We could think of our Indian Constitution is a deeply liberal document and embodies many of the kinds of ideas of that belong to liberal doctrine in terms of freedom. If you look at the beginnings of the Constitution and the statements that are made there in terms of and you may recall Ambedkar's own claims about what it meant to actually be part of such a constitution when you enter a domain of freedom and liberty and equality. So we have embodied, it's not some unique European kind of moment. We're looking at a moment that is global. And she's saying, wait a minute, this story that is told is a very incomplete story, and not only is it incomplete, but it represses. It is repressing a very, very essential part of the story. And she says that, in fact, the so-called contract, the creation of the individual who now has civil rights to enter into contracts with other individuals under the protection and under the control of the state. So the usual structure is a binary structure in terms of civil society and the state. She says there's a third realm that has been completely repressed or completely left out of the story, the so-called private realm of the family and the so-called natural realm. The natural realm of sexual difference, the natural realm within which, in fact, men are entering into or enabled to enter into a sexual contract. In other words, the story is not simply one of all people are entering into contracts with each other. The marriage contract is not like other contracts. It is, in fact, a contract within which one party is subordinate to the other. And so her point is that, in fact, this is assumed to be the case. This part of the story is not told. If you read, the text very clearly, though, there are also very interesting aspects. If you look at Rousseau's text, you'll see, when he talks about the education of Emile and the education of the sister Sophie, he has very different things to say about both of them, right? The education of the sister is all about marriage, while there's the education of Emile is all about becoming a new kind of a public person. So you'll find those elements there, but they've never been fully put together according to her. And therefore, she says, we must pay attention to this feminist critique is in fact telling us that one kind of patriarchy of a pre-modern time has in fact given way to not a realm of freedom and equality, not the Universal Declaration of the Rights of, which we usually think the French Revolution has done in whatever fashion. It is actually a shift from an older classic patriarchy to a modern patriarchy. And that liberalism is built on that modern patriarchy. This is, I think, the deep critique. So that if we in your constructions of, I suppose, in your courses, when you discuss things like liberal feminism, you might have a rather diluted versions, which simply says, liberal feminism says that, women are somehow not equal, but they should be made equal. And that's missing the point. The point is that liberalism is built on it is not about the equality of everyone, it's about the equality of men. And in fact, there are other theorists who will tell you, those are things that she's not discussing so much, there's a racial contract. It's not the equality of men, it's about white men. Brown men and black men are not included in this new liberal contract. And so on, there are many exclusions, and those exclusions are not accidental. It's not that they just happen to forget about, including some people and not others. No, it's built into the very nature of the liberal moment that it has this exclusionary structure, and that marriage as an institution is presupposed. So she has this very interesting, if you look at the introduction, she talks about, and we are very familiar with the word patriarchy, but she makes an interesting distinction between kinds of patriarchy, because there's a very classic notion you might call of patriarchy, which is basically old patriarchy, we might say. The patriarchy of, the father. In fact, literally, if you look at the word patriarchy, it literally means the rule of the father. Patriarchy, yeah? Pitrasata, it's a word that lends itself very easily to translation in any language. The rule of the father, which mimics, that is the rule of the father over the sons, and the women are taken for granted, the father having power over the sons, and this structure of the kinship structure mimics the rule of the king, or whoever may be, whatever the form of actual rule may take. This is classic patriarchy, a mimicking of the sovereignty of the father vis-a-vis the ruler. Okay, and usually then the careless story would be, this is now all gone. We are now in the realm of modern equal rights, and therefore none of this pertains any longer. And this is wrong. This is quite simply wrong, because what has actually shifted, and she describes it nicely, is from the rule of the father, we are coming to the patriarchy of sons. The sons have, yes, they've overturned the father now. The sons now are a fraternal brotherhood. And one of the interesting things, and I don't know whether you've ever thought about it, but there was those three terms that the French Revolution threw out: liberty, equality, fraternity. There's a third term, fraternity. And the term fraternity means brotherhood. That's what it means. And we don't look at that term as much as we look at the previous two, right? So she is saying that this fraternity, this brotherhood, is actually cemented in terms of sons having control, being in a situation of domination, in a relation of subordination to women qua wives. So this so-called new equal world actually is built on this realm of the marriage contract, which in turn then is the basis upon which men enter into other kinds of contracts in civil society, with the only controlling then being the state. The modern state is the one that gives you protection, etc., in civil life. But the fact that there is a prior so-called, which is often dismissed as the realm of nature, sexual division between men and women is thought of as natural, and so on. The realm of the family is called private. So it is not subjected to the same codes of freedom. And those of you who know the history of the 18th, 19th centuries will know very well that, in fact, those were years within which women in Europe had no rights whatsoever. They did not exist as legal or social persons upon marriage. these are things that we often do not actually recall. Of course, they had no voting rights. They did not exist as citizens. And you're aware of the suffragette movement and all of those things. But those histories can only make sense to you if you recognize this prior liberal construct. It is no accident that women did not get the vote, and that it took 1.5 centuries in France for them to get it. And even to this very day, the argument would be that even if to this now, many of the worst forms of exclusion in marriage may have been overcome, women do not lose their identity upon marriage. They can go to a court of law. They can get divorce. They can file for violence by the husband. And most recently, in many Western countries, marital rape is also on the books. When Carol Pateman wrote her book, by the way, in 1986, marital rape did not exist in the law books of countries in the West. So that tells you something. What is it about that why is it so difficult to imagine a situation within which rape in marriage would be recognizable? Why? Because women do not have a sense of property in themselves. They are, in fact, the property of the classic marriage is one in which women are, in fact, almost I will say, slave-like in terms of the relationship in a purely technical, philosophical sense. Not that they are bought and sold as slaves are. We should recognize a big difference here. But in terms of their status as property after marriage, that is a major sort of issue. So this is my first example for you of how profound and how powerful and how brilliant, in a way, feminist philosophers can be in terms of their capacity to open up and completely rework and question existing accounts of, in this case, political philosophy, in this case, the grounding of modern political thinking. Okay, so, maybe I'll just keep going and we can have a question and answer later. But this is you could say, part one of my presentation today. I've done it very crudely. There's a lot more to be said. Those of you who want to read, please read the book, because it goes into much more detail. We don't have to agree with everything. That, again, the idea is not that she said the last word on the subject. There are issues that we can discuss. But I do think that it's a very, very important and very, very deep critique that she has offered of the kind of exclusion that went into the creation of liberal rights in modern societies and in modern thinking. So that's my first example. The second, I want to shift ground in a way. And this is more like what I like to do, because now, in first part, I'm speaking to you as philosophy students, familiar with philosophical thinking, familiar with liberal thinking and so on. But I'm usually not in this kind of context. And what I like to do when I'm in a more interdisciplinary or in a women's studies context is I want to make students who are studying women's studies, who are studying gender studies, to think that, we say we're, in women's studies is said it's interdisciplinary. We draw from all disciplines, we question everything, but we also draw from, we get inspiration and ideas and resources from different disciplines. So I sometimes say, look, there are things you can get from philosophy. What can a women's studies student who's not a philosopher, right, who has not studied philosophy at any point, never thought that philosophy might be what they might need to gain from, what value might be had, and this is where, in bits and pieces now, I will talk about gender as a concept, which is a much more recent concept. Gender, unlike patriarchy, has a much longer history. It refers also, it is not, by the way, many of the concepts, almost all the concepts that are used in feminism are words or terms that we have borrowed. And I think that's brilliant. In my view, there's nothing, why shouldn't we take from somewhere and do something else with it? None of us are in the position to invent words of our own. We're all born into a language that is not ours, and we have to make it ours in some way. So I think feminism has done this in very interesting ways, and patriarchy, as I've given you an example of how Pateman has, in fact, reinvented patriarchy from its classic construction to a more modern construction. Gender is a term that actually, again, not ours. We did not come up with this term. It's an English word, unlike patriarchy, which could be actually lends its patriarchy is a Latin word in terms of its origins, in terms of its structure, but gender is an English word. It has been taken from, and it was not one that was, the meanings that we associate with gender were actually first sort of put out by people in the field of, broadly you could say, medicine and psychiatry and psychology. It was in the mid 1950s in the US, in fact, that the first major, a word was used to make a distinction between sex and gender. Okay, that sort of very ordinary thing that everybody now knows, that there's a thing called sex, which is biological, and everybody knows that gender is supposedly social, and that one is given by biology and the other is constructed in history and in society and so on. This very standard notion actually doesn't have a very long history. Though the ideas that there may be biological aspects to life and or to our identity as distinct from other non-biological aspects. This has an older, even Simone de Beauvoir, for instance, in her Second Sex, she has ideas of gender, but the word gender doesn't appear there. There's no French word for gender, by the way, and that they look for some kind of the equivalent, but we don't have, no other language other than English has that precise meaning. And gender actually is a term that has come from linguistics. I don't know if you're familiar, maybe anybody who studies language and studies grammar. In schools, we all studied grammar, right, at some point or the other. And we learned that their languages have different kinds of genders, that there's a masculine gender and a feminine gender and a neutral gender, that words, that even words that don't have to do with female and male people can also have a gender, right? In Hindi, chairs and tables have a gender. In English, it's not it's not visible because the English language is is low in terms of its gender content. But Bengali has its genders and so on. German has 3 genders, has a neutral gender. Sanskrit, it is said, has 4 or 5 genders. And so this notion of gender was taken from the sphere of linguistics and language and applied to persons. The idea that we as persons can have what is called a gender identity. This is a new idea. This is an idea that dates back to the 1950s. It comes out of medicine. And in particular, it comes out of context of psychosocial development of children into adults. In fact, many of the interesting debates that we're having today around trans identity, around intersex identities, these were in the medical field and in other contexts have had a history of their own. And it was in those contexts within which there was a shifting of a sense of self from one identity to another. That's the context within which gender first took shape. And this is often not known. And it's in the 1970s and 80s that feminists come across this term, this distinction between sex and gender, and are very excited by it. They're excited by a term that makes a clear distinction between what is biologically given, having the sexual characteristics at birth that result in almost all cases in doctors or whoever assigning you a gender at the time of your birth. That is based on external genital characteristics. If those are clear enough, then you're given, it's your baby girl or you're a baby boy, you have a vagina, you have a penis, whatever. If there's indeterminacy, then the medical system gets into a bit of a tizzy over that. That has been subjected to a lot of questioning today, okay? But I'm saying that this assigned an identity at birth, that is considered the identity we call sex. However, and this is what then excited a lot of feminists, that the process of becoming what we have from Beauvoir, one is born a woman, one is not born a woman, but one becomes a woman. So this very process is elaborate, very often tension-ridden, nothing natural about it, becoming men and women in society, that is the sphere of gender. And this is seen as requiring enormous attention. In other words, it's not natural. There is nothing automatic about baby boys and baby girls turning into men and women in some, natural process. It requires considerable intervention, action. It's control, disciplining, punishments if you do it wrong, etc., etc., etc. I won't go into all that here, but so just to say that here was this term gender that was offered to feminists, and was many sort of grasped it with great excitement, because it enabled people to say, well, maybe there's something called sexual difference, but that sexual difference does not account for the many forms and modes that gender takes in our society, and especially the subordinated and unequal forms that gender takes in our societies, and the many different forms it has taken over time, in space, and so on. Okay, so where does so far what I've been saying is, it's you could call it, personal development, child development. It's not particularly philosophical. So why am I discussing this in a philosophy lecture? What I found when I was looking into dimensions of gender, and this notion that, notice therefore, that when we're talking about gendering and the process of the making of genders, we're talking about everyone. We are not just, it's not just the second sex as Simone de Beauvoir put it. It is both sexes, if we want to call it that. It is, in fact, one is not born a man. One has to become a man. One is, so and part of the becoming man and the becoming woman is not two separate spheres. As one might sometimes think there's a public sphere for the man and a private sphere. No, the whole process is deeply interlinked, deeply interwoven, and gendering is something that takes place through the relationship across the sexes. So here is where I felt that there was a place here for a more philosophical also understanding of what hitherto we simply used to call the invisibility of women. When women's movement and women's studies was born, if you like, in academics in the 1960s and 70s, a common point of departure was to say that women have been invisibilized in knowledge production, in society, and so on, and that the task then of women's studies is to make the invisible woman visible, so that her contribution, her place in society can be acknowledged, right? So that was a kind of move that could be made. I think with the help of gender, we can make a more profound kind of move than to simply say women are invisible. Because it seems to me that it is gender itself, this relationship between men, so-called men and women in society, that very relationship is part of what has been rendered invisible. And the way to understand this is to recognize that it's not just that men are more powerful than women, or that men are dominant and women are subordinate. It's actually more interesting than that. The point is that man, the meaning of the term man, and this is true, I think, in many languages and not just in the English language, the term man carries a double register. The term man carries a universal register, as in man, which now, of course, many of us have now dropped as a result of making our vocabulary more gender sensitive. But prior to this gender sensitizing of our language, man stood for everyone. Man was mankind, and mankind as a term is humankind. Mankind has the capacity to refer to everyone. As you know, even the French Revolution Declaration of the Rights of Man, capital M, is meant to, it's claiming universality, right? So the term man has this capacity to be a universal category as well as refer to the male of the species more specifically, right? So you have a term on the one side of the relationship, which is universal and specific, universal and particular. And the other side, you have a term like woman, which does not have that capacity. The term woman can never, ever claim universality. Womankind will never refer to everyone. Womankind only and always has a specific meaning. Okay, so if you look at this, look at the asymmetry here. The asymmetry is not simply an asymmetry of men have more power than women. The asymmetry is men can stand for everyone. Women can only stand for women. Right? So we have what we might call a false universal of sorts. Men are a false universal. That is to say, men stand for everyone and in their own. So if a room is full of men, nobody thinks that, you know, there's a real problem here. They can represent everyone. If a room is full of women, then we will immediately say, my gosh, this is just a women's meeting and where are the men? Okay, so the invisibility of gender, in other words, has been created by the fact of historically the male standing for everyone, and that everyone has, as it were, rendered invisible the actual relationship of gender, the actual relationship that men have over women. And I just want to make sure you've understood me here. Prior to the sensitization of our vocabularies, it was very common for, we would say chairman, we would say he, nobody said he, s/he, all that came much later. So all the pronouns, all the names were only male, and that was considered fine. That was considered okay. And that universe, that the idea that this is somehow exclusionary was not understood or not noticed. It could go in, it could be invisibilized, it could be suppressed, it could be rendered, you know, below the realm of knowledge. So here is what I would say is a philosophical entry point beyond the question of social difference or other kinds of inequalities. We bring in theories of the universal, of the particular, into a discussion in a women's studies classroom to make the term, to bring a philosophical kind of dimension to understanding what is the strength of this concept called gender, and why is the concept of gender a valuable one for us then, to understand what goes without saying, what is it that isn't understood in society. So this is good as far as it goes, and it's very valuable. However, I also want to say that, and this is perhaps why, you know, I find myself moving in and out of philosophy, if you like. I find myself drawing from philosophy, but then also having to go elsewhere. So while understanding the nature of the concept of gender can benefit, you know, we benefit by pulling philosophy into our discussion, by making a dialogue with philosophy, we also have to go elsewhere. We have to go outside of philosophy to get into what I've called the paradox of gender. And what is this paradox? To put it very simply, the paradox of gender is that if we look at the sex-gender distinction, if we look at the broadly, the distinction between biological differences between men and women and social and other kinds of differences that go into the creation of men and women, then we could say, perhaps without too much of controversy, we could say that in pre-modern societies, in societies without capitalism, without industry, without all the amenities of modern life, without schooling and so on, simpler societies, agricultural societies and so on, we could say that in such societies, the differences of sex, that is to say, being born into a male sexual body, being born into a female sexual body, would have carried very large consequences. In societies where physical strength mattered a great deal, you could say that a male body with its mass of muscle, that is, you know, we know from the Olympics have just finished, you know that, you know, men are always, if there's a race, men are going to be faster than women. There's no two ways about that. There's something about body mass, the composition of the muscles, whatever, that makes sure that that will happen. There are levels at which then the physical attributes of a man can translate into having stronger kinds of capacities. And on the other hand, women, that is, who are women in the standard biological sense, who have children, are in a situation in pre-modern times when we don't have all the amenities of modern life, when you have multiple childbirths, very high rates of mortality, and so on, not the health benefits that we think of that we take for granted today, women would have been burdened by this situation of multiple childbirth, maternal mortality, and all the vulnerabilities that go into such a situation. One of the biggest vulnerabilities that could happen in such situations is, in fact, that women did historically across the world have. So what I'm trying to get at here is that the social consequences of physiological difference, childbearing in the one case and physiological strengths in the other, didn't have to. Women could be strong. That's not my point. My point is, however, that they could carry large social consequences in societies. The interesting thing, though, the paradoxical thing, though, is that in these pre-modern societies, the social consequences are not so visible most of the time. If you look at public codes in many societies, you look at the public modes of presentation, the dress codes of pre-modern societies, you will not find very profound gender differences. If you look at kings and queens, for instance, of pre-modern times, you look at our Rajas, even in India, look at our Rajas and so on, and look at their dress codes, for instance. You will see that they wore all the colors of the rainbow, they wore jewelry, they used all kinds of makeup, all the things that today we would either say that they are trans people or they are homosexual, or we would find reason to be profoundly disturbed by this mode of dress and behavior compared to the modern time. In modern societies, the societies we know in the last 100 or so years, the actual social consequences of physical differences have become much less. The kind of work that modern societies engage in, which are highly technologically mediated, do not require some special strength on the part of anyone. In fact, the first workers in industrial Britain were women and children, not men. And office work and other kinds of work do not require there is absolutely no reason to imagine any kind of physiological differences having any say. Having children today has become a very different story from the old, from health and medicine have ensured that fertility now has come down. Some people don't even have children, they may have one or two. Children go to school, then the mothers and women are not in a situation of permanent care for children as used to be the case before there was schooling. So in many, many ways, the social world is such that the social consequences of these differences have become less and less. But, and this is the paradox is that gendering has become bigger and bigger. The social and political and other modes whereby men and women are being defined have never been bigger than they were from 19th century onwards. The very years of liberalism when the world was changing was precisely the time when women were said, you're incapable of rational thought. You're incapable of voting. You're incapable of this, that, and the other. You have to be in the home. Your only place is in the home. The housewife was created in the 19th century. So this paradox, I hope you're getting my point here. The paradox is that gendering is not as profound in pre-modern times when sexual difference is greater. It becomes much, much more profound in modern times. And in fact, there's this book by John Gray called Men Are from Venus, Mars. Women are from Venus and men are from Mars. Okay, this is a book written in the 1990s. Now, imagine this is a book written at a time in modern life when the actual differences between the sexes is as small as you can get. And yet the differences between men and women is considered so vast that is, we are not even born on Earth. It's as though one species had been born in one planet and another species had been born on another planet, as though we were so completely unlike each other, so completely incapable of even connecting to each other, that a book like that becomes a bestseller. So this is what I'm trying to, this is the paradox of gender. The paradox of gender is the maximizing of difference at a time when it's absolutely unjustifiable in the basic physical terms. You could say, here's a society where equality can easily, childcare can be arranged, schooling can be dealt with, Physical differences no longer really matter. And all the talk of brain size has been already sort of thrown to the winds as so much hogwash. So even so, or precisely at such a time, we have a maximizing of the idea of a man and a woman being so profoundly, or the phrase opposite sex. I don't know if you've ever wondered, what is this phrase called opposite sex? Why are we opposite? I mean, we may be two sexes, okay, you know, but what's this opposite business? Like, are we like on two sides of a, is this a duel between two opposites? What is going on here? So what is it about society? And this, I feel, is where we need investigations and insights that go beyond philosophy. Philosophy can give us some things, but can't give us other things. We need to go into psychology. We need to go into sociology. We need to go into economics and other realms, ideological, maybe discussions to figure out what is going on that makes this gender difference seemingly so insurmountable, so huge. And of course, we know that it's a construction. We know that these are things that can be actually questioned, and that's precisely what feminism has done. This process of questioning I'm suggesting here in the second part, and I'll stop now, is this combination of needing and using resources from multiple disciplines, of which philosophy is one, but not the only one. So I'll stop there and really look forward to a discussion now. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. That was an absolutely brilliant lecture. You tied together so many different strains of thought, so many different strands of thought, so many different theorists and questions. And just, I love that you ended on such a note of hope. Because like you said, you characterized this whole, you characterized this as an entry point, right? And so there's so much more research to be done. I personally have a lot of thoughts that, I mean, I'm obviously going to let the audience ask questions first, but I would love to email you personally. I think that there's lots of space here to do something like, I don't know, experimental philosophy studies, maybe just intuition solicitation, rather, of people outside the academy to see how they think about the severe gendering that we see in our times, right? Now we will move to questions, ma'am. What I see here is that no one's really asked questions in the chat. I
see somebody's got a hand up.
Yeah, okay, all right. So I guess we'll do that. We'll do it this way. All right. Shambhavi, please go ahead. Would you like to? Yeah.
Yeah. Ma'am, so I have a very basic question.
Okay.
Because most of my personal feminism has been influenced by liberal feminism, but now I am discovering more, I'm trying to study more in more of the history of feminism and how it came into being. And I'm also currently reading The Second Sex. And now I'm really confused about who really is a woman, because currently in current discussions, when we relate to the biological experiences of women, we get the argument that not all women go through the same, not all women get menstruation cycles, because and if you try to do that, you are trans exclusionary. And then if you try to include everyone, then the whole concept of woman sort of fades away. So like what would be the right way to think about the identity of women in the contemporary world?
That's a very, there are interesting phases, cycles. It's a sort of spiral, you could say. Simone de Beauvoir thought there were only two sexes, and the first sex got to be the universal all the time, man, and the second sex was always being, devalued, and hence her amazing work on the second sex, which there's another wonderful book that combines so many kinds of investigation. It has philosophy, it has biology, it has personal, there's a part 2, you must make sure that you get the version that also has part 2, where she talks about growing up, being a girl, growing old. She doesn't only talk about menstruation, she talks about The other side of the story that many of us go through that nobody's interested in, when we stop menstruating, and so on. So I think we need to have we are in the process of, these are not, first of all, these are ongoing investigations of which there are no final answers. The most important thing is not to claim that I don't believe that the last answer. See, biology is what biological discourses and practices have done. It is what society has done. It's not what you or I are doing. It is what is assigned by the world, whether it be a medical world, whether it be, if you're born at home and there's no medical person around, somebody decides, looks at your genitals and takes a call. And that is assigned, as the phrase would give. You're assigned gender female, you're assigned gender male. If you are intersex, if you have what would be considered an ambiguous genitalia where you can't make out, you can't, the size of the penis or the clitoris or whatever do not measure up to these standards which the medical books would have us have, then there are issues there. And there's been an intersex movement that actually is also worth looking into. I think it's as significant, as the trans movement, of those whose sex could not be determined, and where it was believed that the medical, the job of the medical establishment was to fix a gender and fix a sex, and to decide one way or the other whether they were, which is, I think, what many intersex people have said is a mistake, and they should not do that. And they should allow them to grow, maybe with some social identity given, but one that would be open to change later in life if they so wished. So I think these are complex questions where for some, there may not be an issue. For some, the gender designated, the sex that is assigned at birth continues through life. You may or may not, even if when you go, you may for whatever reasons have a menstrual issue. You don't menstruate even though you have a uterus. And those are variations. I would imagine that those are not big issues. The big issues, I think, the interesting question is those who feel what is called dysphoria. That is to say, a sense that what the body that they inhabit and what they would want to be, the kind of body they would want to inhabit, as distinct from the body that they do inhabit, that there is a disjunction here. And I think that is what trans persons are bringing to our notice. And I think it is going to take time. I think we're still in the early stages of even knowing what, you see, it's not as though trans persons have all the answers either. Just because you have a sense of some sort of a disjuncture doesn't mean that you know exactly what it is that you are either. We are all creatures of desire of one kind or the other, right? We desire to be something. We also desire to love someone. We think we've understood at least the fact that till very recently we assumed normative heterosexuality. We assumed that if you were assigned gender female at birth, then becoming a woman would also mean falling in love or agreeing to marry a man. Yeah, that was part of the equation, okay, of being a woman, was to have a man, and vice versa. That gender assigned male at birth meant you became a man and you had to be heterosexual. You couldn't possibly be loving another man. That wouldn't work. So that has taken time to unravel, okay, and open up and recognize that indeed the becoming woman and the becoming man does not necessarily carry with it heterosexual normativity, right? Now we're in a situation where we're recognizing that there are people who are finding a language within which they are saying, it's not just that I desire to love someone that is not the normative person I should love, but I also am desiring to have, it's like a man saying, a person assigned, let me put it correctly, a person assigned gender male at birth, who at some point says, I hate having this penis, I don't want this penis, and I would just love to have breasts the way women have them. Okay, and that this then takes a form that is recognizable and acceptable and not thought of as a problem. And I think the reasons why some feminists have a problem with people who are assigned a certain sex and then over time decide that they would like to be actually aligned with another sex. I think that would require another lecture altogether. I won't get into that here. It's a complex set of questions. But I think there is space to open up this terrain and go into this kind of a conversation, which often gets foreclosed. It gets foreclosed when trans exclusionary feminists say that unless and until you're a biological woman, there is no way you can be a woman. And that is foolish and wrong. But that doesn't mean that there is not a conversation to be had. Because for women who have grown up knowing that sense of subordinate, the gendering of being a biological woman, the gendering that goes with being biologically female, the feeling of disempowerment and so on, that is part of that, and that they want to fight and overcome, they need to have a conversation, a better conversation with trans persons who are talking about wanting to become another kind of gender. I think that conversation is not a simple conversation to be had. And that's where the distrust and the boxing down and the closing off is happening today in some contexts, like Rowling, its famous claims that she made, and which has been, and others have made similar claims. That needs a separate, I would say, let's leave that for another time. It's I think feminism is not by definition trans exclusionary feminism. That there are some feminists who are unfortunately making that move for wrong reasons, for wrong reasons, according to me. But we need to have a conversation. It's not as though no conversation needs to be had. So that's my answer. I hope I've begun to open it up for you. And liberal feminism, you see, I think we need to also, these labels are very heavy. You're a generation that doesn't need to go with so many labels. You're the trans generation, your generations where your pronouns are now multiplying. So, open up the terrain of the feminist corpus, look at different people. Nobody is simply a liberal and nobody is simply a this or nobody is simply a that. I don't even know whether Carol Bateman in this book is radical or liberal or what is she, let's not go there. Why do you want to find labels? I'm glad you're recognizing the limits of the kind of feminism that you think you've inherited, which is, has good things to say. Liberalism is about equality and freedom, right? It's a good thing. These are good things. But it's too simple to simply remain with those little sort of those terms. We have to go beyond those. Yeah, I hope I've responded to your question, Shambhu.
Yes, ma'am. That clarifies it a lot. Thank you.
Yeah.
As I've mentioned in the chat box, please feel free to, yes, ma'am, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Urna. And thank you so much, ma'am. While I was listening to your lecture, there were so many phases of my life, when I started reading feminism and when I had no idea what feminism is. And still I used to realize that, there is something wrong with the society, but I didn't know what is that thing which is wrong. Okay. And then I started reading about feminism and gradually I was very much confused. What is happening with me? Okay. So, and what is happening with this world? Why people are not understanding, why I am not able to understand this world. While I was listening to your lecture, I was going through all those stages of my understanding. Okay. Because the way you have taken up this issue of sexual contract, because that is a very liberal thinking which gives us this hope that rather than being a woman, we suddenly become an individual. Okay. So problem is solved. So there is nothing we should be worried about. And while I was doing my PhD, I was thinking okay, yeah, liberalism is a good thing. So chalo sari problem khatam hui. Okay. So finally, I'm an individual and I can enjoy my life in abstraction. Although nobody was understanding how, even I was not able to understand how should I live in abstraction. But still, there is something better than nothing. And then I used to follow this idea of liberalism, convincing myself and struggling with others that Rawlsian theory is the best theory, because you go, you
veil
end
of ignorance.
to a hypothetical situation where, it's so good. Nobody has asked me whether I want to be born as a woman or a man. So somebody is actually, giving me that opportunity. And then I read Carol Bateman, Susan Okin, okay, and Martha Nussbaum and everybody, and I started thinking, what has happened to me? Where was I? And you have, your lecture has completely, bound all those aspects in such a good manner that I can't tell you how happy I am that those small issues which we hardly realize, I always find it very fascinating that if violence is happening against someone, it is very easy to recognize if a physical violence is happening.
Absolutely.
But when a mental violence is happening, when some other kind of linguistic violence is happening, if people are able to understand it and point it out, then it becomes much better. And your lecture has done that. It has tried to point out those things which we consider to be very normal, quote and unquote. So, it's like I was thinking that Carol Bateman's sexual contract, yes, obviously there are so many aspects which have to be covered and which could not be covered in just a lecture, as you have already said, racial contract and everything else. So, and that obviously is not to undermine the value of why women should be included. And then the idea, when you said that the category of man is a universal category, I was thinking, and I want a clarification from your side, that whether this idea, when introduced as a man, was just to create an idea, create a language through which they can talk to everybody, where everybody means just those who are capable of having the conversation, okay, which doesn't mean plants, which doesn't mean animals, which doesn't mean women, okay. So whether that idea was created in order to have a conversation or everything, whatever is going on in the world, with a particular word, not even realizing that they should be including women, because women shouldn't be included, okay. And because they didn't use the word female and male, that all males, if they were so proud of their sexual identity, they could have done it rather than using men, okay, or mankind. So women were not the part of that conversation, which was only happening amongst the homosexuals, as the term has been used by Irigaray. I just am wondering, like, when women started being included gradually, okay, I was thinking rather positively that probably the group of women was separated from the group of men, okay, and then man was universalized. It was to just represent everybody except those people who are not rational in terms of Kantian sense, probably, okay. So then woman's category has emerged as someone who is also representable, okay, who are also fighting for that category, which has been specifically created specifically for men, okay. So do you think that there is something somewhere we have gone wrong in this whole idea?
No, I think this is fantastic what you have said, because I think if we take both the Bateman problem and the gender question of the false universal of the man, then we can see why a simplistic liberal feminism won't work. It is a simplistic liberal feminism will say, oh, they were a little exclusionary. They didn't mean it. They actually wanted to include you guys, but they didn't they didn't put the women there. Now we just add the women. Women are now henceforth, women are individuals. We'll change the laws. We'll do this, we'll do that, and ensure that women get this, equal pay for equal work, etc., etc. But then, lo and behold, it doesn't go away. Suddenly women are doing all the housework and going to the office and coming back and making the tea and providing sexual satisfaction at night and getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning to get the children ready for school. Okay, so some funny stuff is going on and the sexual contract continues. So we are now in a society where there's multiple layers. It's no longer the old, it's not that the woman it's not the old housewife, though many in our society today are actually classic housewives still to this very day, or rather are being made housewives to this, have no other public necessarily space of their own. But we need to, therefore, that's why we can't simply make an additional, it's not just now let the woman, because it's very, as women, as we grow up, if any of us have a desire to be part of something more, we naturally find liberalism exciting and open and the place to go and the place to discover. And what you're saying about Rawls, the veil of ignorance and so on, this is the most, we can actually forget about, my breasts and my vagina and all the objectification that I'm going through and my bad cramps, and none of that matters anymore. And, I can just, it will be a genuinely just set of choices in front of me. But then it doesn't, some people have those cramps and some people don't. And some people want to, in fact, they have the breasts that women have and they're, that's what they want, whatever. And so the Rawlsian exercise begins to sort of crumble. And it doesn't just crumble. It shows that, in fact, the edifice of the abstract is built on what the Pateman has talked about, that this has actually been assumed here. This is already in the mix and has already taken place. And suddenly you just want to, make an addition at the top without actually questioning the bottom. So it will need, therefore, a more thorough questioning and change if, in fact, genuine equality, as distinct from just a surface equality. Surface equality can actually imply, and I think there's no better articulation of that than Ambedkar. Ambedkar has said that if, in fact, you create equality in a society of unequals, you will actually create only more inequality, right? If you treat unequals as equal, and okay, today we are all going to run a race with, all these elite runners. We're all equal, right? We're all equal. We'll all run the race together, and it's a fair, whatever it's called, playing field, and so on. And obviously, it's not going to work. Obviously, there's going to be some people who are going to be way ahead in that race, thanks to not just physical bodies, but social, economic, and any other kinds of advantages that they have. So if we are going to call this equality today, just by fiat, we are actually going to create a widening inequality amongst us. So we must look at the sources of that inequality. And Carol Pateman gives us one part of that story. Okay. Yes. Yeah, so that's my answer to you. So we have to recognize the extent to which, and liberalism, unfortunately, is just it works with a very simple kind of structure of all individuals add up to the social. Its capacity here is very limited. Each individual, full capacity, full rationality, full this, full that, and maybe just supply them, even the Amartya Sen versions, supply them with the capabilities to realize, without recognizing the structures within which some people are always being made more capable than others. And unless we look at those structures, simply saying, okay, let girls now go to school and this and that, and all will be, hospital births, whatever, will not get at the full issue that is at stake here. I think that's really what you. Thank you for that. Thank you.
So if nobody is going to, obviously this session is for the audiences.
Yeah, I hope I haven't left people behind. Have I maybe it has been too quick. Please, students.
I am just waiting whether I will get another chance to ask, because consider me a very curious student, and who has found a very appropriate teacher with whom I can ask so many questions which are coming to my mind. Okay, Urna, yeah, you continue.
Yes, ma'am. There is a question from Madhurima in the chat. Professor John, would you like me to read it out? Would you like to read it out yourself?
Okay. Let me just take a look. Okay, let me take a look. Given that we have more and more genders being identified nowadays, how can we include them in our pronouns without making it impossible to have a universal pronoun? Today's they, them, she, her might not fully cover the identities of new gender identities coming up. How can we accommodate them all? Should we forego the need for universal pronouns for the sake of convenience in light of several such specific, or are such universal possible without invoking suitable? This is a discussion we need to have. I mean, I would say that it's not for us to decide. I think what I'm not quite, I would maybe not quite agree with, how do we make them, the sentence structure you're using is one where it sounds like your pronouns are not an issue and you're worried about other people's pronouns. And that's not a very useful way to go, because there are many times when maybe I don't know what yes, I would, if I'm a little old and maybe I need to put in brackets she/her next to my name, because whatever discomfort I have with and I'm very discomforted with the social identity woman. I don't fit that social identity woman in so many aspects of my life. I'm not a particularly feminine person, but I've never wished to transition into something else. My discomfort has not taken that shape. There's a profound discomfort, and I would like to discuss that kind of discomfort that I experience with the what you might call patriarchal constructions of women, as different from someone else's wanting to either transition into out of being a woman or transition into being a woman. In fact, those are all very, very interesting conversations to be had. So I think we will have to start a discussion around the pronouns. You see, there was a time, when as I said in the talk, that everybody thought that basically the he pronoun, he, him, his, man was the universal that could take care of everyone. And we have demolished that, right? So then we thought we could have S/HE, he or she, that was attempted in a binary mode to be more inclusive and recognize the limitations. And now we will learn. I mean, there are people who would like to be pluralized, like they. There are people who would like to have a new pronoun, ZE, or some other kind of formulation. HIR, maybe. I mean, we are in a process of, it's a genuinely open-ended, interesting moment when the last thing we want to do is to decide what's the right way to go. Let's not say, why do we need a universal pronoun? Do we? If we do, then let's go for some plural term. Maybe, we, they, it's plural, doesn't have a gender contained in it, if that's what we want to do, if we need to. We maybe, the species called Homo sapiens, because we're doing such horrible things to the rest of the world. And who knows, tomorrow we're bringing the planet to an end. And all of us, of whatever genders, will have their part to play in that problem and in figuring out a solution to that problem. We want the trans persons to be as much a part of the solution of the problem of climate change, and what is called the Anthropocene, right? Anthro is the man. Again, this would be a man, right? The anthropo. So we can come up with a better, more gender neutral or gender inclusive term for that Anthropocene. Sometimes we'll want it, and sometimes we can manage with a multiplicity of names. And more importantly is what is not so much getting the pronoun right. I think more importantly is having the conversation, right? And ensuring that these are conversations in which people feel included, feel wanted, feel that whatever story one has is a meaningful one, and that we are not in a situation of conflict and outright distrust. That is what matters. And let's not pre-decide what pronouns are going to be part of that discussion or not. Is that okay, Madhurina? Okay, all right.
Thank you so much. Ritu ma'am, please proceed.
Thank you so much. Another thing which was coming to my mind while I was listening to your lecture was the term opposite sex. Okay. And it's like, I guess you might correct me if I'm wrong, that it's also a very modern phenomenon, because the opposite sex was not that discussed earlier in pre-modern phases. So
Correct,
probably,
correct.
yeah. So we had, in, as you said, in pre-modern era, uh, whenever there was a discussion about men, okay, so men were, obviously they were rational, okay, they are rational, and it was trying to represent everybody, okay. And after the emergence of liberalism, rationality became one of the very significant characteristic of any man. Now here, probably they meant man by saying man, okay, not representing it universally, because making something an exclusive characteristic of
Yes.
someone, so
Yes.
that is exclusionary. So then I guess these are all my assumptions, and please correct me, ma'am. So I guess when liberalism has emerged, rationality, because of the emergence of, simultaneously, because of the emergence of capitalism, because physical strength was no more the dividing or distinguishing criteria here between men and women, because of the industrial revolution and all. So rationality has to be that thing which can create a distinction between men and women. Okay, so that is why this opposition between rational and emotional has to be maintained. Then once again you can create a hierarchy, that why do we need to be here, even though you don't need the physical strength, but you need mental strength, and you biologically don't have that. Okay, so am I going in the right direction? Because
yes, well,
yeah.
that's what we could look at. You're absolutely right that it's the 19th century that comes up with. I mean, let's look at. I mean, the point is not that the pre-modern times was a time of equality. That would be a biggest mistake. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that it didn't require the elaborate gendering of difference. That in fact there was classical patriarchy. Let's make no mistake about it. Let's look at your Greek society, your Aristotle, ideas of inferiority, etc., etc. They had their own idea, but they didn't need opposite sex. That is they didn't need opposite. They could simply say the slaves are not capable, the women are not capable, they should not be part of the demos and so on. They didn't require elaborate constructions of gender opposition. That's the point. Whereas you're absolutely right, modern society needed a very elaborate construction of difference, including exclusive ideas of rationality, the idea that the bourgeois woman should be in the home, and she should be, delicate and sweet, and there was psychoanalysis and hysteria, and you name it. I mean, the 19th century is amazing for the theories of even brain difference are 19th century theories to try and bolster. So one of the ways to understand this is that precisely in a time of profound transformation and revolution in so many spheres of life that was turning life upside down, you then needed to come up with theories of difference that would ensure that that in fact things did not get too out of hand. I mean, this would be maybe an overly simple way of looking at it. That you then precisely when women and children were out in the mines and in the factories spinning and so on, and then you had the factory acts to say no, that's not a good idea. Let the women go home and the men should have the jobs. But things were turning so upside down that you then had to find new ways of constructing and determining difference, and the old ones wouldn't work anymore. And we might say that these elaborate ideologies and constructions and philosophizing and medicalizing and all the many levels and layers within which these differences were then sought to be set in place, and they're not empty. Again, it's not that these are just clothes. When I say clothing, I mean the example of clothing is remarkable because it's in the 19th century that male clothing undergoes a profound change. The gray and the black suit is a late 19th century invention. Can you imagine, these kings and queens, the kings of the pre-modern and our rajas wearing gray and black? I mean, it's unthinkable. They would have died. But gray and black become the new norm of this new rational man who has a public life and so on, very sober, commanding enormous, of course, amounts of power in financial terms. So the banker, these new constructions go with very, very clear codes of masculinity. In which if the banker had been wearing pink and yellow and wigs and so on, can you imagine? It would have. It's interesting why the two strike us as ludicrous, but no, that kind of new sense of power had to be accompanied by a whole color code and dress code that went with that. Whereas the women's dress codes could become more and more whatever it was, frilly and pretentious, and high heels. I mean, pre-modern men wore high heels. Yeah, if you read these, these Baroque novels, you'll see all these men with their high heels. No more high heels, right? So except for the standard man, could not wear those kinds of. So yes, I think we need to imagine elaborate codes of inhabiting difference, which are not, again, I don't want to say that they're simply externally imposed. We need a more complex understanding of how we live these differences, to what extent we consent also to these differences. Many women love dressing up, love wearing makeup. We cannot, how shall I say, a very disciplinary, radical feminist position, which says this is all, patriarchy and you cannot do this and this is all wrong. That's not particularly useful. I think we need to recognize the many ways we inhabit that difference. And within that, we need to ask ourselves, what is debilitating? What is subordinate? What is exploitative? What is wrong in these modes? And what would be, in that sense, a mode of being that would beyond something, which we none of us know today. We don't know what would be beyond gender or beyond existing gender. And that's maybe where some of us sometimes have a quarrel with trans persons, because trans persons seem to be emphasizing gender difference that we want to transcend, right? When a trans woman says that wears the very takes on the bodily of a very, very beautiful woman with perfect breasts and perfect this and perfect that, we want to say as feminists that why are you going for this kind of construction of the woman? That's a very patriarchal construction. We are trying to go out of this kind of construction. These are the areas where we need better conversations, because we're coming from different places. And those conversations can happen and will happen. But yes, I think you're on the right track when you say that modernity seems to have required a much more elaborate and much more damaging. That's the sad part. It's a much, much more damaging mode. I mean, I think the classic patriarchy is obviously what's wrong with it. Modern patriarchy is much more subtle, but it's extremely damaging. If all women are supposed to become hysterics by just, sitting at home and waiting to have their babies in this bourgeois world that was created, that created mental illness of a profound kind. So we need to look at those things. We certainly do. Thanks, Rita. Yeah.
Yeah, Urna, I guess there are other questions.
Yes, ma'am. One question from Ishta Gupta. Would you like me to read it out, or will you just read the chat box like before?
Oh, Ishta, could you? Oh, sorry. It's not only. Wait.
Yes, that's right, ma'am. I asked for a clarification.
It's not only restricted to the pronouns, but also to the day-to-day language we use for everything, like in ordinary text. The dialogue usually covers the man and ignores everyone else. Can you spread? Are you saying that existing dialogues are usually meant to that public life is dialogues between men and we hardly have real dialogues? Is that what you're saying?
No, ma'am, which is why I asked Ishta for a clarification, which she very kindly provided. You'll see that her final message in the chat box, yes, in any text for that matter.
In any text for that matter, a person, and that person is, the text is usually understood as a man. No, you're quite right. So we can go round in circles here. You're absolutely right that, we said, oh, no, we mustn't say chairman, we must say chairperson. But what happens if tomorrow the chairperson is invariably the male of the species? Then are we really making change happen, or are we going back to hiding? Are these false universals that are actually exclusionary? So yes, these things can happen. I mean, we need to name these problems and then look for better solutions. So the answer may not be chairman or chairperson. The answer may have to be, we really need to find ways in which there are women there and trans persons who are also chairpersons and so on. So that actually the term person and persons with disability and so on occupying these positions such that indeed it is indeed a little more diverse and a little more inclusionary than otherwise. Because if it's just a name change, right? If it's simply a name change and nothing else changes in the structure and the men are where they were and all the CEOs and all whoever are all the same old people, then it's an empty change. Then it's in fact, you could say it's actually hiding the problem because that term person is actually hiding the fact that there are only male there. But the thing I just want to give you an example of in everyday language is this issue of the asymmetry between men and women and the terms, the inclusionary, the universal particular. One of the examples I've used is, even in our ordinary languages, like in Hindi, for instance, when we're talking about children, we use the words beta and beti, right? Now, notice that in everyday usage, up to a point, the term beta can be used for both boys and girls. It's not a source of disturbance if a little girl is called beta. But if you have beti and you were to call a little boy beti, there'd be a huge disturbance. Do you see what I'm getting at? So it's not just, the language of the, Declaration of the Rights of Man. It's everyday language. Everyday language carries this asymmetry, right? Where one can contain both and the other can never contain both. A little boy, my God, he will go into a frenzy if he has this, he's quite conscious of being a boy, right? And he wants to have nothing to do with girls. But a little girl being called beta will not necessarily go into a frenzy over being called beta, right? Because if she has, once you have, internalized this notion that indeed you're somehow part of that. So this is socialization. This is the way it works in the languages that we use.
Ma'am, if it's all right, yeah. I would like to point out a connection to Ishta's question and what you said afterwards. So in undergrad, we had this feminist thought elective, I think I'm forgetting the name, in first year. And our professor, she introduced Carol Pateman's work with a very interesting metaphor, which has a lot to do with Ishta's question. She said, when on WhatsApp, suppose you don't have a DP. When you don't have a DP, then there's this little man, like it's a circle and a little thing. Are you familiar? Like a little body?
Yeah, right.
And that's the universal, like it's just there. It's the default. It's the default DP.
It's the default DP, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
And so
I think I have it because I don't have a picture.
Because you don't have a personal DP. So I remember our professor, she said, well, use that metaphor and apply that to what Carol Pateman is saying about this so-called, universal social contract that we're supposedly all a part of. And she also brought up the veil of ignorance argument. She said, everybody, in the text, you're all part of that social contract. But are you really if the default DP is a little man, right?
Absolutely.
So, that's I just wanted to share that.
Yes, it's a great illustration. I think the beta beti is one kind of illustration in everyday life.
Definitely,
this would be another one. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Ma'am, of course, thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, if you had anything more to say, please proceed.
No, I'm sort of, my voice is reaching saturation level.
Yes.
It was great to interact with you. I hope those of you who've been more quiet haven't been sort of, so I can often be a very quiet person and I love listening to a discussion where I'm not necessarily speaking up, but I just hope that what I said made some sense and that you will have other occasions in which to discuss this and connect it to other lectures you must be having too. So that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Urna, up to you.
Yes.
Or to you, sorry.
Yeah, of course. So on behalf of my colleagues at the Philosophy Project, I'm offering the vote of thanks now. Professor John, thank you so much for an absolutely enthralling lecture on the new directions that you see philosophical feminism taking in the days to come. And I would like to thank you especially for foregrounding, not just the liberatory possibilities that feminist theory, both holds and has enacted, but also for pointing out that feminist theory is its own interdisciplinary intellectual project, and that there not only does there need to be space actively fought for in philosophical academia for feminist questions, but it's also its own thing. Like, you dignified it, which I really appreciate. So thank you, ma'am. I would, of course, like to thank our pillar of support, Professor Ritu Jaiswal. Thank you so much, ma'am, for headlining this entire thing, for your constant support, and for making the discussion much livelier than it would have been without you. I would like to thank the ICPR, as always, for their constant support. And last of all, I'd like to thank our, I don't want to say audience, I'd say classmates isn't the right word either, but everybody who's taken the feminist philosophy course and who's been with us on this journey since March. This was our last lecture, the last installment of the feminist lecture series. And we ended with a bang, thanks to Professor John. So yeah, I'd like to thank everybody who took the course. We hope that you really enjoyed it, and we hope that you'll join the philosophy project again when we come up with some new venture along these lines. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Urna, and thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you so much,
all the best,
ma'am.
and it's a great